I've been asked to talk this morning about socialism and the United Order. And I assure you that I approach this discussion with a great deal of trepidation. And I hope that my conclusions will be at least as sound as the researchers who had the project to determine how far and how long a flea would jump. They first trained him to jump when he heard the word, and then they pulled off a pair of his legs and said, "Jump," and he jumped. And then they repeated that cycle, and he jumped until they came to the last pair of legs. And when they pulled them off, they said, "Jump," but he didn't jump. And so they concluded that when all the legs of a flea were pulled off, he became deaf. Now, perhaps a good starting point on this subject of socialism and the United Order would be to start with the definitions. Webster defines socialism as a political and economic theory of social organization based on collective or governmental ownership and democratic management of the essential means for the production and distribution of goods. Also a policy or practice based on this theory. George Bernard Shaw, the noted Fabian socialist, says that socialism, reduced to its simplest legal and practical expression, means the complete discarding of the institution of private property by transforming it into public property and the division of the resultant income equally and indiscriminately among the entire population. George Douglas Howard Cole, noted author and university reader in economics at Oxford, who treats socialism for the Encyclopedia Britannica, says that because of the shifting sense in which the word has been used, a short and comprehensive definition of socialism is impossible. We can only say, he concludes, that socialism is essentially a doctrine and a movement aiming at the collective organization of the community in the interests of the mass of the people by means of the common ownership and collective control of the means of production and exchange. Socialism arose out of the economic division in society. During the 19th century, its growth was accelerated as a protest against the appalling conditions prevailing in the workshops and factories and the unchristian spirit of the spreading industrial system. The Communist Manifesto, drafted by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels for the Communist League in 1848, is generally regarded as the starting point of modern socialism. The distinction between socialism, as represented by the various socialist and labor parties of Europe and the New World, and communism, as represented by the Russians, is one of tactics and strategy rather than of objective. Communism is only socialism pursued by revolutionary means and making its revolutionary method a canon of faith. Communists, like other socialists, believe in the collective control and ownership of the vital means of production and seek to achieve, through state action, the coordinated control of the economic forces of society. They differ from other socialists in believing that this control can be secured and its use in the interests of the workers ensured only by revolutionary action, leading to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the creation of a new proletarian state as the instrument of change. A major rift between so-called orthodox socialism and communist socialism occurred in 1875 when the German Social Democratic Party set forth its objective of winning power by taking over control of the bourgeois state rather than by overthrowing it. In effect, the German Social Democratic Party became a parliamentary party aiming at the assumption of political power by constitutional means. In the 1880s, a small group of intellectuals set up in England the Fabian Society, which has had a major influence on the development of modern orthodox socialism. Fabianism stands for the evolutionary concept of socialism, endeavoring by progressive reforms and the nationalization of industries to turn the existing state into a welfare state, somewhat on the order of the Social Democrats in Germany. Fabians aim at permeating the existing parties with socialistic ideas rather than by creating a definitely socialistic party. They appeal to the electorate not as revolutionaries, but as constitutional reformers seeking a peaceful transformation of the system. The difference in forms and policies of socialism occur principally in the manner in which they seek to implement their theories. They all advocate the same things, in this respect at least. First, that private ownership of the vital means of production be abolished, and that all such property pass under some form of coordinated public control. Second, that the power of the state be used to achieve their aims. And third, they all claim that with a change in the control of industry will go a change in the motives which operate in the industrial system. Well, so much now for the definition of socialism. The United Order, the Lord's program for eliminating inequalities among men, is based upon the underlying concept that the earth and all things therein belong to the Lord, and that men hold earthly possessions as stewards accountable to God. On January the 2nd, 1831, the Lord revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith that the church was under obligation to care for the poor. Later he said, I, the Lord, stretched out the heavens and built the earth, and all things therein are mine, and it is my purpose to provide for my saints, for all things are mine, but it must be done in mine own way. On February the 9th, 1831, the Lord revealed to the prophet what his way was, whereby he intended to take care of his saints. And in this way there were two cardinal principles. One of them was consecration, and the other stewardship. To enter the United Order, one consecrated all his possessions to the church. This he did by a deed, in the words of the Revelation, which cannot be broken. That is, you completely divested himself of all of his property by conveying it to the church. Having thus voluntarily divested himself of title to his property, the consecrator received from the church a stewardship by a like conveyance. This stewardship could be more or less than his original consecration, the object being to make every man equal according to his family and according to his circumstances and his wants and his needs. This procedure preserved in every man the right to private ownership and management of property. At his own option, he could alienate his property, he could keep it and operate it, and it could be passed on to his heirs. The intent, however, was for him to operate his property so as to produce a living for himself and his family and other dependents. So long as he remained in the order, he consecrated to the church the surplus he produced above the needs and wants of his family. This surplus went into a storehouse from which stewardships were given to others and from which the needs of the poor were supplied. These divine principles are very simple and easily understood. A comparison of them with the underlying hallmarks of socialism reveals similarities and basic differences. Now, these are similarities. First, both socialism and the United Order deals with the production and the distribution of goods. Both aim to promote the well-being of men by eliminating their economic inequalities. Third, both envision the elimination of the selfish motives in our private capitalistic industrial system. Now, the differences. The cornerstone of the United Order is belief in God and acceptance of Him as Lord of the earth and the author of the United Order. Socialism is wholly materialistic. It's founded in the wisdom of men and not of God. Although all socialists may not be atheists, none of them in theory or practice seek the Lord to establish His righteousness. Second, the United Order is implemented by the voluntary free will actions of men. This is evidenced by the consecration of all their property to the Church of God. Socialism is implemented by external force, the force of the state. Third is to the ownership of property. As to property, in harmony with the church belief as set forth in the Doctrine and Covenants, that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience and the right and control of property. The United Order is operated upon the principle of private property and ownership and individual management. Socialism on the principle of collective or governmental ownership and management. Thus, in both implementation and ownership and management of property, the United Order preserves to men their God-given agency, while socialism deprives them of it. Fourth, the United Order is wholly non-political. Socialism is wholly political, both in theory and in practice. It is thus exposed to and riddled by the corruption which plagues and finally destroys all political governments which undertake to abridge men's agency. 5. A righteous people is a prerequisite to the United Order. Socialism argues that it, as a system, will eliminate the evils of the profit motive. The United Order exalts the poor and humbles the rich. In the process, both are sanctified. The poor, released from the bondage and humiliating limitations of poverty, are enabled as free men to rise to their full potential, both temporally and spiritually. The rich, by consecration and by imparting of their surplus for the benefit of the poor, not by constraint, but willingly, as an act of free will, evidence that charity for their fellow men, characterized by Mormon as the pure love of Christ. No, students, socialism is not the United Order. Distinguishing between these two systems need be no more difficult than solving the problem of the farmer who couldn't tell one of his horses from the other. They weighed the same, they pulled the same load, they ran at the same speed. From the looks of their teeth, they both were the same age. Finally, as a last resort, he measured them. And sure enough, the white horse was 6 hands higher than the black horse. Now, however, notwithstanding my abhorrence of it, I am persuaded that socialism is the wave of the present and of the foreseeable future in our world. It has already taken over, or is contending for control, in many, if not most, nations. At the end of 1965, socialist parties affiliated with the Socialist International were in control of the governments of Great Britain, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Israel, and the Malagasy Republic. They had representatives in coalition governments in Austria, Belgium, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. They constituted the chief opposition in France, India, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and West Germany, and were significant political forces in numerous other countries. Many parties dominant in Africa, Asia, and Latin America announced that their aim was a socialist society. We here in the United States, in converting our government into a social welfare state, have ourselves adopted much of socialism. Specifically, we have, to an alarming degree, adopted the use of the power of the state in the control and distribution of the fruits of industry. And we are on notice, according to the words of the President, that we are going much farther. For he is quoted as saying, "We are going to take all the money we think is unnecessarily being spent and take it from the haves and give it to the have-nots." That's the spirit of socialism. We're going to take. It isn't the spirit of we're going to give. We have also gone a long way on the road to public ownership and management of the vital means of production. In both of these areas, the free agency of Americans has been greatly abridged. Some argue that we have voluntarily surrendered this power to the government. Well, be this as it may, the fact remains that the loss of freedom with the consent of the enslaved, or even at their request, is nonetheless slavery. As to the fruits of socialism, we all have our own opinions. I myself have watched its growth in our own country and observed it in operation in many other lands. But I have yet to see a single instance, or hear of one, of its freeing from the hearts of men selfishness and greed, or of its bringing peace, or plenty, or freedom. These things it will never bring, nor will it do away with idleness and promote industry, thrift, and self-respect. For it is founded in theory and in practice on the principles of the evil one. Now, as to the fruits of industry, if we had time, as the fruits of united order, if we had time, we could review the history, or what little we know about Zion in the days of Enoch, and about what happened under those principles in the first 2 centuries following the time of the Savior among the Nephites. I suggest that you read them. Well, now, what can we do about it? as I recently reminded my wife of the moratorium on the United Order experiment and that socialism is taking over in the nations and that its express aims will surely fail, she spiritedly put to me the question, well then, what do you suggest? That we just sit on our hands and weep in despair and do nothing? Perhaps similar questions have occurred to you. The answer is no, by no means. We have much to do, and fortunately for us, we know that the Lord has definitely prescribed the course we should follow with respect to socialism and with respect to the United Order. He has told us that in preparation for the restoration of the gospel, he himself established the Constitution of the United States, and that there might be a government which, according to just and holy principles, would preserve to men their God-given agency. This he did because the whole gospel of Jesus Christ presupposes men's untrammeled right to exercise their free agency. Man is in this earth to be tested. The issue as to whether he succeeds or fails will be determined by how he uses his agency. His whole future, through all eternity, is at stake. Abridge man's agency and the whole purpose of his mortality is thwarted. Without it, the Lord says, there is no existence. He, that is the Lord, so valued man's agency that he himself designed and dictated the laws and constitution required to guarantee it. This he explained in a revelation in which he instructed the prophet Joseph Smith to appeal for help, and I quote, appeal for help according to the laws and constitution of the people, which I have suffered to be established and should be maintained, for the rights and protection of all flesh, according to just and holy principles, that every man may act in doctrine and principle pertaining to futurity, according to the moral agency which I have given unto him, that every man may be accountable unto me for his own sins in the day of judgment. And for this purpose, to preserve the rights of men's free agency, I established the constitution of this land by hands of wise men, whom I raised up unto this very purpose. Previously he had already said, and now verily I say unto you concerning the laws of this land, it is my will that my people should observe to do all things whatsoever I command them. And that law of the land which is constitutional. And then he gives the test for the constitutionality of the laws in his interpretation. That law of the land which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. Therefore I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law which is the constitutional law of the land. And as pertaining to the law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. I, the Lord, make you free. Therefore ye are free indeed. And the law, that is the law that's constitutional in the eyes of God, also maketh you free. Nevertheless, when the wicked rule, the people mourn. Wherefore, honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men ye should observe to uphold. Otherwise, whatsoever is less than this cometh of evil. These scriptures reveal the fact that the Constitution is a divine document. They tell us that according to just and holy principles, the Constitution and the law of the land, which supports the principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before God. That as pertaining to the law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. They remind us that the Lord has made us free, and that laws which are constitution will make us free also. And then right at this point, almost as if he were warning us against what's happening today, the Lord said, "Nevertheless, when the wicked rule, the people mourn." And then, that we might know with certainty what we should be doing about it, he concluded, "Wherefore honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men ye should observe to uphold." In its context, this instruction can only mean that we should seek diligently for and support men to represent us in government who are wise enough to understand freedom as provided by the Constitution and as implemented in the United Order, and who are honest enough and good enough to fight for the preservation of that freedom. Under no other government could the church have been established, said President Clark, and he continued, if we are to live as a church and progress and have the right to worship as we're worshiping here today, we must have the great guarantees that are set up in our Constitution. There's no other way in which we can secure these guarantees. Well, now, not forgetting our duty to eschew socialism and support the just and holy principles of the Constitution as directed by the Lord, I shall conclude these remarks with a few comments concerning what we should do about the United Order. The final words of the Lord in suspending the United Order experiments were these: "And let those commandments which I have given concerning Zion and her law be executed and fulfilled after her redemption." Thus, further implementation of the order must await the redemption of Zion. And here, Zion means Jackson County, Missouri. And when Zion is redeemed, as it most certainly shall be, it will be redeemed under a government and by a people strictly observing those just and holy principles of the Constitution which accord to men their God-given moral agency, including the right to private property. If in the meantime socialism takes over in America, it will have to be displaced, if need be, by the power of God, because the United Order can never function under socialism or a welfare state, for the good and sufficient reason that the principles upon which socialism and the United Order are conceived and operated are inimical. In the meantime, while we await the redemption of Zion and the establishment of the United Order, we as Latter-day Saints should live strictly by the principles of the United Order, insofar as they are embodied in present church practices, such as the fast offering, tithing, and the welfare activities. Through these practices, we could, as individuals, if we were of a mind to, implement in our own lives all the basic principles of the United Order. Now let me give you some examples of that. When the law of tithing, you remember that the principles underlying the United Order are consecration and stewardships, and then the contribution of surpluses into the bishop's storehouse. Now when the law of tithing was instituted, 4 years after the United Order experiment was suspended, the Lord required the people to put all their surplus property into the hands of the bishop. That was at the start of tithing. And thereafter, they were to pay not their surpluses, but 1/10 of their interest annually as tithing. This law is still in force, as you may have heard about. And it implements to a degree the United Order principle of stewardship, for it leaves in the hands of the individual the ownership and the management of the property from which he produces the needs of himself and family. And furthermore, to use again the words of President Clark, in lieu of the residues and the surpluses which were accumulated and built up under the United Order, we today have our fast offerings, our welfare donations, and our tithing. These we pay into the church of our own free will in place of the surplus. We're not ready yet to ever have a surplus if we leave it to ourselves to judge. So the Lord lays down specifically a tenth, a fast offering, and welfare contributions. All of these may be devoted to the care of the poor, as well as for the carrying on of the activities and the business of the church. Furthermore, we had under the United Order a bishop's storehouse in which were collected materials from which to supply the needs and wants of the poor. We have a bishop's storehouse today under the welfare program used for the same purpose. We have now under the welfare plan all over the church land projects formed for the benefit of the poor. Thus, in many of its great essentials, we have in the welfare plan the broad essentials of the United Order. Furthermore, having in mind the assistance which is being given from time to time to help set people up in business or in farming, we have a plan which is not essentially unlike that which was in the United Order when the poor were given portions from the common fund. It is thus apparent that when the principles of tithing and the fast are properly observed and the welfare plan gets fully developed and wholly into operation, we shall not be so very far from carrying out the great fundamentals of the United Order. The only limitation on you and me is within ourselves. And now, in line with these remarks, for three things I pray. First, that the Lord will somehow quicken our understanding of the differences between socialism and the United Order, and give us a vivid awareness of the awful portent of those differences. Second, that we will hear it at this university, develop the understanding and the desire and the courage born of the Spirit to eschew socialism and support and sustain in the manner revealed and as interpreted by the Lord those just and holy principles embodied in the Constitution of the United States for the protection of all flesh in the exercise of their God-given agency. And third, that through faithful observance of the principles of tithing, fast, and the welfare program, we will prepare ourselves to redeem Zion and ultimately live the United Order. In the name of